Hello, I'm Kate Bulkley, and welcome to Watching the White House. This is brought to you by ITN and Broadcast magazine. As America continues to reverberate from the fallout of the storming of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, the spotlight has turned to examining how President Trump was able to use partisan mainstream media and social platforms to create a toxic political environment that ultimately led his supporters to rioting in Capitol Hill and in Trump's unique second impeachment. It can also see him prevented from running for office ever again. I'm joined by two award-winning correspondents who have spent years reporting on events in America and witnessed the dramatic changes that have taken place in both the political and the media landscapes there. Although I'm not sure either of them have ever seen anything quite like this before. Welcome to ITN News' Robert Moore and Matt Frei, who is a presenter and European editor for Channel 4 News. Thank you both for being here with us and in different time zones as well. So just before we start, let's watch a bit of Robert Moore's coverage of the storming of the Capitol. Hi guys, by the way.
USA! USA! USA!
This is exactly what was feared, but in no way is this a surprise. It has been fueled by the president's rhetoric, and it's increasingly clear this election has not healed the wounds. It has simply amplified them. And so here we are right now inside the halls of Congress. This is exactly what so many anticipated, and yet the Capitol Hill police are doing their best, but failing to control the situation.
Robert, this is just amazing footage. It's really quite shocking. And of course, it's gone viral around the world. It's been seen all over. You really were the only group in the Capitol doing this. I assume you were a little concerned for your safety and your crew's safety, but put it in perspective for us. I mean, several people actually spoke to you, given the sort of the toxic description of the mainstream media by Trump and his supporters. I mean, they were talking to you. How do you explain that?
Well, we had kind of almost embedded ourselves, Kate, in that crowd in the sort of minutes before they stormed the Capitol. And it was, we've seen a lot of anger in Trump's America, but this was on a different level. This was kind of off the charts, if you like. This was a kind of inner fury that we hadn't ever really encountered before. And it was mixed with all the toxicity of kind of militias and white supremacism. And so it was a pretty alarming mood in that crowd. As we walked in, we saw signs sort of saying murder the media. So we did feel a certain concern for our welfare, but also it was clear this was kind of an historic moment. And our job at that moment was to try and capture some of that venom, but also some of the passion. I mean, these were people who didn't actually believe they were intruding on a federal building. They didn't see themselves as violating the inner sanctum of American democracy. They thought it was their house, it was their real estate, if you like. And that was what was so striking, is that these rioters, these insurrectionists, if you like, actually believed they had every right to do it. Indeed, they thought that political events absolutely justified it.
I mean, it's amazing. And I want to get you to talk a little bit more about that. But Matt, let me bring you in. As you watched what was happening in the Capitol, what was your reaction? How do you square that with the America you covered when you were in Washington? I mean, this seems like a seismic shift.
Well, my first reaction actually was envy for Robert and admiration for the piece. It was a jaw-droppingly good piece of television. I was watching it on my sofa in the room that I'm speaking to you from now, and I really felt for him because, first of all, where was the social distancing? You in these sort of rather weird COVID times, that was one thought that flashed through our mind. Secondly, I really wanted to be there myself, and I thought this is incredible that he managed to keep going and do all these amazing pieces to camera, literally go with the flow, and as you said yourself, Kate, also talk to people who didn't thump him, right? Maybe the British accent is a wonderful way of talking people off the cliff in these very heated moments. So while he was channeling his kind of inner Hugh Grant, you know, being sort of articulate and polite to all these extraordinarily violent people, I was channeling my inner green monster. But the thought I had, frankly, was, I'm surprised this didn't happen earlier, right? I mean, America has been tribally divided long before Trump. Trump, of course, was an accelerator of all this, as Robert said in one of his pieces to camera. And then the election was an amazing period of non-resolution. In all those things that were supposed to be resolved by a free and fair election, which of course it was, were then heightened. So that, you know, something like 85% of the 74 million Americans who voted for Trump, the second highest vote for any presidential candidate ever, thought that it was a lie, that the election was a lie. That is an astonishing thing. So it's not surprising that this happened, I have to say, on Capitol Hill. It is still deeply shocking, though.
Yeah.
Matt,
Robert, what do you
Matt,
think?
I was going to ask Matt, actually, where do you think the roots of this lie? Do you think it lies in the sort of Tea Party and the revolution of the sort of 80s and 90s? Or do you think it predates that and goes back to kind of the populism of Andrew Jackson and the 1830s? I mean, it feels to me, and it even felt to me then, that actually there are deep historical roots for this sort of wild populism in America, and we're wrong to regard it as a beacon of stability. That's just not necessarily how it's played out over 200 plus years.
Robert, I couldn't agree with you more, but I also think that there's a deeply unpopular view amongst those Americans who still think that the country is an exceptional piece of, you know, democratic work, which of course it is on one level. But remember, and I'm sure you all know this, in the 19th century, American politics was punctuated by violence, and not just the Civil War. I mean, that was the height of it. But there was violence all along, and there continued to be violence afterwards. But in a sense, you know, of course, the level of violence that we saw on the 6th of January was nothing compared to what America was used to in the past. But the verbal violence, the torrent of verbal violence, and this is where we're going to talk about regulation later on, but this is where cable news really comes into it, the tribalization of the information landscape, where literally tens of millions of Americans firmly believe, as if it's a matter of, you know, religious sanctity and piety, that this election was stolen from them. You know, that is an extraordinary place, and we have the journey to that place, which culminated on the 6th of January and may have other events, you know, in the future that we don't even know about yet. That journey started a long time ago, and I would say if you're going to look at kind of original villains in all this, I would point the finger directly at you, Newt Gingrich. Yes, Newt, still supporter of Donald Trump, you know, leader of the right-wing revolution in Congress in the 1990s, who destroyed the rather cozy consensus between the Democrats and the Republicans. You know, before that, they all played golf together, famously Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House. That was kaput by then, and Newt Gingrich was the beginning, the founding father of tribal rivalry America.
It's interesting because, Matt, you talk about that, and I totally agree with you. There's deep roots for this. Robert, do you also think that it's been, let's say, inflamed or underpinned by the shrillness of the U.S. media outlets? I mean, you've got Fox News on one side, you've got MSNBC on the other side, and they're both yelling and screaming. It just seems to me that's part of it.
It is. I mean, I think that the kind of one of the key kind of weapons is actually social media in this, and the algorithms that drive some of these conspiracy theories, because, you know, that is something where people are kind of, you know, each coalition, if you like, in sort of American opinion is coalescing, and social media is driving a lot of this. But undoubtedly, that in turn is being accentuated by the tribal nature of broadcast news, and in terms of the 24-hour news channels here, which are incredibly partisan in themselves. I remember Matt saying to me when he got here, he turned on the evening, you know, 24-hour channels, you know, whether it was Fox or MSNBC, and he wanted to throw things at the television. Isn't that right, Matt? Because you said you couldn't believe how partisan and sort of one-dimensional the nature of those panels are. And I think that is a fair point. It's not just the partisanship, it's also, you know, what we could call the panelization of television news in America. It is basically people from about, you know, in the evening sort of prime time hour sitting around a table, and opinion has completely taken over and dominated the kind of reporting ecosystem in America. Isn't that what you felt when you kind of arrived as an outsider, Matt, and turn on your Fox or your MSNBC?
Oh my God, Robert, there aren't enough things to throw at the television in your average hotel room, quite frankly. I mean, it is these people, and by the way, CNN is part of this equation as well, on the liberal side, or what you call the liberal side in America. I mean, what's really interesting, and I learned a little bit about this because in a different era, a distant era, I used to anchor a program on BBC World News America. And we went for the kind of, middle of the road, well-informed news. And our rival, as the BBC in America, was CNN, which tried to do exactly the same thing. Question your own assumptions, take information from all sides, be good, salt of the earth journalists. Of course, that didn't prevent people from thinking that we were hopelessly left-wing or maybe even too right-wing. The point is we tried, right? We tried, we really did. And by the way, our audiences were infinitesimal, including CNN. So on a good night, we used to beat CNN, and we're talking about 120, 150,000 American eyeballs, watching these programs, while Fox and even MSNBC, which is kind of going up in the polls at the time, we're doing a lot better. The business model for cable television is that you play to the gallery. You go for your audience because the advertisers like it, because you have a loyal base. In politics, we're always talking about you go for the base. Well, that's what the broadcasters have done. That's what CNN has done, and MSNBC and Fox. Although, funnily enough, I was speaking to some women in Virginia, women for Trump, and who thought that Fox had become far too liberal, and they were now going to Newsmax, which is even more right-wing. And it'll be fascinating to see how both sides of this broadcasting landscape, the left and the right, deal with the infuriating kind of consensus-driven, middle-of-the-road relative tedium of a grown-up administration under one Joe Biden. What do they do? I mean, for Fox, it's actually easier than for CNN and for MSNBC. But it'll be fascinating to see how they change their own kind of ideological constellation around this new star.
Let's look a little bit into Trump's unique personality, because his desire for attention, courting the media, provoking the media. Matt, you did an interview with Mary Trump. Let's watch a little bit of that, because that kind of shows you what we were dealing with here. So how Trump sort of galvanized this group. Let's play that clip.
Assuming for a minute that he is going to lose this election, that the numbers pan out as we've all been predicting in the last 24 hours or so, do you think there will be a scintilla of regret in your uncle's mind about the kind of things that he said all along, from the very beginning of the birther campaign to, being rude about the late John McCain, to even what he said last night about stealing the election?
No, there won't be any regret whatsoever, because that would suggest that he can acknowledge that he's done something wrong, which he cannot do. So we're in for a very difficult 76-day period. I have no doubt in my mind there will be legal challenges, which will most likely go nowhere, which will increase his levels of anger. I'm afraid also that we'll probably be seeing people abandoning him, which will also increase his levels of anger. So he can continue to do a lot of damage, even though when and if Vice President Biden becomes President-elect Biden, he still has the power of the presidency for the next 76 days. And we need to be prepared for anything that he might have in mind, because one thing that's really important to remember about Donald, if he thinks he's going down, he's going to try to take the rest of us down with him.
So Matt, I mean, that was incredible. I mean, how prescient was that? And what does it say about the future of Trumpism? You talked about sort of, the relative sort of plain vanilla Biden administration. I mean, is Trumpism going to be alive and well? And what's going to happen?
Well, I think actually just first of all, for that interview, Mary Trump, I've talked to quite a few times. And whenever your kind of critical Trump batteries were flagging, you would basically plug them into Mary L. Trump and they would get recharged in about a nanosecond. Because, she had this incredible insight to him because she was both his niece and used to get on with him quite well, actually, until she was cut out of the will, the father's will. So her grandfather's will. And so she knows him as a family member. And I love the fact that she talks about Donald, but she also knows him as a psychologist. And she thinks that he is suffering from an acute and undiagnosed case, of ADHD, but also acute narcissism. And I think she's probably right. I recognize those traits in myself a little bit, I have to say. So, I think she's probably right on that one. But when it comes to Trumpism, Trumpism was there before Donald Trump, and Trumpism will continue after Donald Trump. The question is, with what cheerleader? It's possible that Donald Trump will survive a kind of avalanche of legal cases and even, a conviction in the Senate, which is very unlikely. Correct me if I'm wrong, Robert. He will survive all that to kind of reemerge in some form or another in 3 years' time. Or maybe he'll be kind of off the main stage, in the wings of politics, holding the feet of every Republican, to the Republican fire in the primaries, which is really the prime danger of Donald Trump, which is why 147 lawmakers voted to overturn the election result even after the events that Robert had witnessed, okay? So Trumpism as a kind of perversion of American exceptionalism, a grotesque version of the American dream, will persist. The question is, will it be under him or will it be under someone else? Or will the party come to its senses, which I doubt at the moment, frankly, and unify around a middle core? Because the thing that makes American politics kind of prone to extremes is not just the media landscape. It's the fact that most seats in Congress, as you know, are not actually competitive between Democrats and Republicans. They're competitive within their own parties. So you've got to appeal to the loudest voice, to the sharpest shriek in the primary cycle, in the Republican ranks or in Democrat ranks. And that is setting you up for extremes to get stronger and not weaker.
So, Robert, when you look at this, has the mood changed in Washington? I assume it has, but obviously we've got Mitch McConnell now making, noises that are anti-Trump, which is, shocking for those of us who saw him support the man. Biden's now in the Oval Office. Trump's been banned from Twitter, other social media platforms. Has the mood changed? What's your view about Trumpism and what's going to happen?
Yeah, I think Trumpism doesn't go away with Donald Trump. I mean, just as Matt points out, the problem is for anybody sort of tacking towards the sort of center of their parties, they face almost instant primary challenges. And of course, Liz Cheney is going to be in Wyoming, is going to be the sort of poster child for that moment, because, who would think that she is going to face a primary challenge because she's too centrist? That tells you where the Republican Party is. So look, the mood is grim here, certainly within the Republican Party, which is facing a clear kind of drift towards civil war as it works out exactly what its kind of core political ideology is going to be. And there we have Donald Trump sulking in Mar-a-Lago, able to, generate huge amounts of cash, but also to intervene strategically and tactically in primaries as they come up. So he's going to be a big presence in the midterms in 2022, and potentially, assuming he doesn't get convicted in the Senate over the next few weeks, he could be a candidate himself for the presidency in 2024. So I think what's clear is this toxic, volatile, deeply sort of passionate and polarizing moment in America is not over. Potentially, it is still building.
But the point is that American system that is so exceptional only really survives if everyone plays more or less according to the rules. Because if a president wanted to behave really badly, the means of stopping him from doing so are really few and far between. And as we're about to find out in the Senate, with a non-conviction of Donald Trump, which is most likely, those things rely on a certain degree of consensus between the big parties. But when you get a complete rupture of the consensus between Democrats and Republicans, and you have a president like Trump who's prepared to trample like an elephant all over the niceties of the Constitution, there's really nothing you can do about it. The system is broken. The system relies on gentleman farmers from the late 18th century, right? Or their version of it. When those gentleman farmers become brutal real estate magnates, from the Upper East Side of New York, you've got a problem. And Donald Trump has regarded the presidency as a private enterprise all along. And the trouble is that there's nothing really there, no process, that can actually really challenge him.
I think you're right, Matt, but I think what also strikes me, how this is not necessarily unique, and we can come to this, and I know Kate would like to take the conversation in this direction. It's not unique to the United States. I mean, all liberal democracies are basically reliant on a couple of things. One is that the loser accepts loss. Another is that there is a media and a national conversation that is broadly understands that, you know, you can't win all the time. And so when you play this kind of brutal politics that Donald Trump has dominated, and it's weaponized by social media, and it's accentuated by the business models of mainstream media, by the cable channels in the case of the United States, then you do have a recipe for, you know, political chaos potentially. And I don't think anybody should be complacent. It's not necessarily limited to the United States. You know, this sort of total political warfare, as Joe Biden referred to it, this sense that everything is in danger and that our opponents become our enemies. You know, that is something that has implications far beyond America's political and media landscape.
Which is why this whole idea, you know, if you look at the legacy of the Trump era, what's the most damaging thing? Is it Trump himself? You know, I don't know, the pipeline projects or picking fights with NATO? You know, all that can be undone. But what cannot be undone, and what I think is his most pernicious legacy, was the phrase fake news and alternative facts, which wasn't even his phrase. It came up, you know, it was Kellyanne Conway. But it's so important because, you know, it means that there is literally no level playing field. There are no yardsticks that are accepted by everyone about what is right and what is wrong, but also what is up and what is down, what is black and what is white. You know, the fact that he lied from the very beginning against the better judgment of literally everyone's eyesight about the size of the inauguration crowd, which, Robert, you know, we were there for the previous 4 inaugurations. They were all bigger. I'm sorry, Mr. Trump, they just were. Oddly, the one that was smaller was the one a few weeks ago because no one could show up. But the point that he lied about it and then stuck to the lie, and that the lie was perpetuated from the podium of the White House by Sean Spicer and by Kellyanne Conway, set the tone for the very big lie with which he ended his presidency on the election.
So how is it, I mean, as news journalists, as reporters, as people that are trying to get some kind of truth or facts across, what tools do we have in our arsenal at this point? I mean, do we need regulation? Do we need the return of the fairness doctrine, which is something that was dumped in the U.S., you know, in 78, I think. You know, I mean, what do we do? I mean, how do we get through this? Do you have any thoughts about?
We have Valium.
Is social media? Do we need to regulate social media? I mean, what happens?
Well, it seems to me that the fundamental passport, the kind of to success for broadcasters and for a benign political culture is an old-fashioned word. It's trust. I mean, we need a journalism and a kind of a media ecosystem that understands the difference between truth and falsehood, that has journalists and news teams and news executives who understand that there is a bigger picture than just trying to, as Matt puts it so eloquently, just trying to, you know, be the most shrill and to play to the greatest number of eyeballs. It needs a kind of a sense of responsibility. And I think that is something that, you know, Ofcom and British regulators need to examine in the aftermath of the poisonous 4 years that America has endured. You know, when new entrants come into the UK media space, which is, I think we should all broadly welcome. You know, we enjoy competition. It's done us a tremendous amount of good as ITV News and Channel 4 and Channel 5 and BBC News and Sky have all competed. That's been a net gain for British viewers. But I think there is a lesson to be learned here, that there is a danger that if people just basically are shrill and play to the kind of the darkest instincts of their audience, then I think we do take the national political conversation into a very dangerous and toxic place.
Robert, you're completely spot on with the analysis, but I'm not as optimistic as you are. And I'll tell you why. I think, first of all, there's an economic factor why those shrill voices, especially on cable television, won't go anywhere, because it just makes them too much money. You know, they make money hand over fist with this particular model, the dual revenue stream, you know, of cable revenues and advertising, to an audience that may not be the biggest audience in America, but it's a loyal audience. That can be turned into lots and lots of dollars. Social media platforms have a similar issue. You know, they don't want to be known as publishers because that means that they pay a lot more tax than they do now as platforms of opinion. But the most important point, which is why I think this problem will not go away, has to do with the constitutional amendments. What the Second Amendment on the right to bear arms is to the lack of gun control, to the power of the NIA, despite its recent bankruptcy. The First Amendment on free speech is to the power of the media, to be tribal, to be poisonous, you know, to be the opium of their tribe. That's the point. And if you look at the way that this, you know, the attempts to bring cable television in America under some kind of control, what do they? And by the way, you know, of course, the good. What was it called? The Declaration of, remind me, Kay, that went out in 1987.
Declaration of Independence.
Good, the good.
Oh, the Fairness Doctrine.
Yeah, okay.
Fairness Doctrine.
So the Fairness Doctrine was kicked out in 1987 under Reagan, and it was partly to kind of open up the media, you know, in the television world, and most importantly then the radio world, to the kind of freedoms of opinion that you already had in newspapers, okay? And then once things started to get serious with talk radio, and then of course with the beginnings of Fox News, that's when political attempts started to be made to bring back the Fairness Doctrine. They have always failed and founded on the rocks of the first constitutional amendment for the freedom of speech. Exactly as any attempt to really rein in guns has founded on the Second Amendment of the Constitution. That, I'm afraid, is not going to go away. And it's where America's exceptionalism, its almost religious worship of these parchment documents from the late 18th century, can actually become its greatest, you know, enemy, its greatest hindrance to real reform. And of course, in order to reform any of that, you've got to have a 2/3 majority in the Senate, which you're not going to get.
Okay, now I want to play another clip because, Matt, I like this clip that we have of your Trump fans. And the reason I want to play it is because it kind of shows this tribalness. And also, what I like is that the different people that we'll see in this clip, it's not just all old white men, if you see what I mean. So if we could play the Trump fans clip that for Matt, please.
If you are a patriot, if you are an American, you know, you don't cross the line. You don't. I don't care what the circumstances are. You do not cross the line. We respect law and order, and we respect our federal buildings. We don't destroy.
And what about the people inciting those who entered the Capitol, the president himself?
No, the
did
president
not
did not incite it. And, I really take issue with you saying that. I'm really insulted that you would sit there and say that.
Do you think that this election was stolen from the Republicans?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And how do you explain that?
How do I explain that? The evidence is there. There is so much evidence.
The courts have decided that the election was fine. You know, the Republicans that were put in charge by this administration in various states to count the votes and look after the process said there was nothing wrong with this election. What on earth makes you think that it was a fraudulent election?
When you have 150,000 more votes than voters, is there anything wrong with that? It's over and over
But
again.
that never happened. There weren't 150,000 more votes than voters. It's just nonsense.
I'm giving that. I'm not saying it's exactly that number, but this has happened over and over again. More voters, more votes than voters. We are loyal to President Trump because of the way he has stood for the Constitution, the way he has stood for law and order, the way he has protected this country, the way he increased the economy in this country.
But he's not going to be president by next Wednesday.
That's right, but he is not going away. He's not going anywhere.
So, Matt, I mean, you've said, you're not particularly optimistic about being able to change this, and it comes down to maybe the two big constitutional amendments in the U.S. I mean, impartial TV news has been the cornerstone of the UK media scene. We've got, I think Robert's already mentioned the launch of some new channels. GB News is coming. We've got the launch of News UK. what will be the impact of these kind of news tone and styles for public service news, which is part of, what you all represent?
Well, it would be terrible. But I mean, there's an interesting addendum to that interview with those three women. We sent them the tape, we sent them the link, and they were delighted with it. They were absolutely delighted with it. And they were delighted with it because no one had ever asked them for their opinion who wasn't a Fox News reporter or a Newsmax reporter. And here we get to the heart of the problem. A lot of the people who voted for Trump feel as if they have been treated as an irrelevance or sneered at by the media establishment of the United States. So you've got to try and talk to these people and understand where they're coming from without necessarily agreeing with them. And at the moment, no one in America is doing that. And the reason why in the UK we have, we will get UK, TV and GB TV, and, it's obvious. I mean, it's part of the Brexit landscape. And rather like the Brexit vote, these media channels will be justified by saying, we talk to the parts of Britain that tend to get ignored by the BBC or Channel 4 News or ITV. But actually, we're not really ignoring them. We are reporting a lot of what these people think and say. We're constantly traveling up and down the country, much more actually than these opinion-based panel shows that you get on cable television in America. But that's not the way it comes across. So we as journalists and they as politicians have to find a modus operandi of talking to these people that is not condescending, but it really tries to find out what they want. And if they want something that's silly or undoable, or self-harming, then you've got to try and explain that, from the best possible, with the armory of your knowledge and experience, not just give in to it. But that means that we have to be very responsible. And, let's be honest here. I'm as complicit as the next TV journalist in the rise of Donald Trump. I did 9 documentaries about Donald J. Trump in 2016 and 2017. I am not going to do 9 documentaries about President Joe Biden, I can assure you that. Okay? We gave him the oxygen of publicity. Robert, I don't know, you probably did many more pieces about Trump than about the other candidates back in 2016. Or maybe you didn't, I don't know. But it was just this sort of, because we like a story. I mean, I remember going on about Barack Obama when people thought that it was a bit of a joke that he was running. And so, this is the great thing about America. You go out, in these endless election campaigns, you go to the primaries, and you find a little corner of America that no one ever goes to normally, and you suddenly see this alchemy of politician and support, and you can feel if there's something special happening.
So, Robert, what's your reaction to this? I mean, let me just ask you a question. There's a saying that what starts in the U.S. ends up coming to the U.K. at some point. So is the U.K. media landscape in the danger of taking on this same kind of shrillness that we've been talking about, like Fox? And is that a problem? I mean, Matt seems to say it is, and there's only so much we can do about it, because in some ways we have to tell the story, and sometimes the most compelling story are the people who are making shrill comments.
I think it's, Kate, I think it's absolutely a concern. It would be, I think, it would be impossible to be here in the United States over the last, couple of years and to look at the array of cable TV news and say, this is a healthy state of affairs. I mean, to an extraordinary degree, people are in panels either agreeing with each other in a kind of broad political consensus, or if it's choreographed in a different way, screaming at each other in sort of perpetual enmity. So you don't want that coming near a TV screen near you. You're concerned about the health of democracy. It is shrill, it is polarizing, facts get completely discarded. So I think the question then becomes, and this, this is an issue of our times, and it's going to be a pressing issue for Ofcom. As we move forward over the next few years, do we keep our clauses going forward that there needs to be accuracy and impartiality if you're going to have a television license and you're going to broadcast news in the United Kingdom? This is going to be a big issue. Of course, it's true, it's massively complicated by the often the sort of negative toxicity of social media platforms who are not regulated in such a way. So, if it was easy, we wouldn't be having this discussion. It's an extremely complicated kind of blending, intersection of politics, of media, of technology, big tech colliding with big money in the United States. So it's very complicated, but it's good that we're having this conversation, because I can assure you from what Matt and I watch here in the United States, you do not want what is playing out on cable news to be coming to Britain, because it is a deeply poisonous and negative influence.
I mean, we're coming to the end of what we're doing here, watching the White House, but I just want to end on that. So it sounds like, Robert, you were saying, Ofcom should take note. I mean, it looks like former Daily Mail editor Paul Dacre is in the running to be appointed by the government to head Ofcom. What would be your, words of wisdom to Ofcom, Robert? And then I'm going to ask Matt the same thing, and that'll sort of wrap us up here.
I would urge them to replay tapes from the United States and from cable TV channels. Just choose a random day, a year ago or 6 months ago or 3 months ago, and watch that. And then ask yourself, is that how you want the television and media landscape to be in Britain? Because, I said it actually in my piece to camera on the steps of the Capitol as literally as Congress was being stormed, that this is not a surprise. And I meant that because I've been watching this kind of escalating rhetoric, this incendiary television news talk for several years here. So it wasn't just the talk of Donald Trump. It was also the drumbeat on television news and the cable networks. So look, this was something that was predicted and predictable. And I think I would just urge, anybody who's trying to regulate television news almost anywhere in the world to watch what happened here and to tell me that what happened on January the 6th was a surprise, because it wasn't to me. And I don't think it was to anybody who's been watching the Trump presidency or indeed the media landscape over the last 4 years.
Matt Frei, what would be your advice to Ofcom?
Ofcom is the policeman. That's the good cop and sometimes the bad cop that keeps us all in line. And if you step out of line, they will come after you with a fine, or with a caution, and it has consequences. Nothing like that exists in America for that part of the media landscape that is really bad. And again, don't fall into the trap where you say, well, if the newspapers are allowed to express their opinions in an unabashed way, as they do in this country, then of course the same should happen with television. They're different. Television reaches a much wider audience than newspapers. You have real you have human interaction on television. It's much more powerful as a means of persuasion than reading an article. So I think you've got to watch it very clearly. As Robert said earlier, what happens in America doesn't necessarily stay in America.
This has been fascinating. Both of you have amazing perspectives on what's been going on in America, and also interesting views on what we need to be thinking about in the UK, and I really appreciate your time taking your time away from your regular day job of actually reporting on what's going on to talk to us. We've run out of time on this Watching the White House session with Matt Frei of Channel 4 and Robert Moore of ITV News. Thank you both for your time and your thoughts. This session was brought to you, I will remind you, by ITN and Broadcast magazine. I'm Kate Bulkley. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.